The Besorah Studies, Part 8, The Workers Are Few. Last week, we left Yeshua concluding his verbal exchange with the Perishim, or the Pharisees, and the Torah teachers, by pondering the difference between the old and the new wine. Now, continuing that narrative in Luke chapter 8, while Yeshua was still conversing with those Torah teachers, the president of the synagogue in Capernaum, by the name of Yair, also known as Jairus, approached and fell on his knees in front of Yeshua, begging him to go to his house because his 12-year-old daughter lay dying. However, while they were on their way to the house, they were stopped by a man from the house. He rushed up and said, "Your daughter has died. Don't bother the rabbi anymore." But Yeshua, hearing what he'd said, responded by saying to Yair, "Don't be afraid. Just go on trusting, because she will be made well." So upon arriving at the house, Yeshua ordered everybody outside, and he entered with just the 3 Talmudim, Shim'on, Kepha, and Yochanan, along with the girl's father and mother. Stepping inside, he was confronted by wailing relatives. However, Yeshua says to them, "Don't weep. She isn't dead, she's only sleeping." But of course they knew she was dead. Hence they jeered at him and ridiculed him for what he was saying. Not deterred, Yeshua took her by the hand and said, "Little girl, get up." Her spirit returned and she stood up, and he directed her to be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. Yet again, Yeshua did not turn that event into a public spectacle. Instead, he told all present not to tell anyone about what they had witnessed. None of Yeshua's healing was ever done to bring attention to himself. Instead, his actions were always done with a genuine concern for the person involved, because he was totally altruistic. Further, there is never any suggestion of any money being solicited or even payments being offered. The raising of the little girl and the resurrection of Eliezer or Lazarus, whom we'll consider in detail in a future session, is a contrast that is important to consider. The little girl had died that same day, while Eliezer had been dead for 4 days when Yeshua brought him back to life. Therefore, Eliezer is the only person who has been truly resurrected apart from Yeshua himself. And that provides the model of how Yeshua will raise people from all periods of history during his 1,000-year reign. Now, the narrative about Yeshua's encounter with Yair and his daughter was interrupted between the plea for Yeshua to go to the house and the time when he arrived. Now, all 3 of the synoptics give a detailed account of the woman who was suffering from a haemorrhage for 12 years. It's an interesting insert into the middle of the subject about Yair and his daughter, and it stands completely apart from that event, yet it slipped into the middle of that subject. Mark's account says in chapter 5, we see an unnamed woman had the courage to actually touch the tzitzit on the robe of Yeshua. The tzitzit is spoken about in Matthew 9:20. While she was being pushed around, jostled around in the midst of the crowd, "If I touch even his clothing, I will be healed." And instantly the hemorrhage stopped, and she felt her body had changed, and she completely healed from the disease. At the same time, Yeshua was aware that the power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothing?" That gives us an indication of what occurred when Yeshua healed a person. Clearly, there was a transfer of energy draining from him to provide the power for the healing. I think it's important to consider this point because he was calling on the physical resources of the universe to heal people. The act of healing was tangible. It wasn't an unexplainable celestial event that sort of came in from wherever. It was totally tangible. He felt the situation in his own body, that he was giving out energy to restore that person. And I think it's important to consider that point. It is worth noting how his Talmudim responded in verse 31. You have people pressing in on you, and you still ask, who touched me? That was a perfectly reasonable question given the circumstances, but it shows just how much they still had to learn about their master. In verse 33, we see the natural reaction from the woman. She was frightened and trembling, and she fell down in front of him and told him the whole truth. Now, we're not privy to what she revealed to him, but she had been inflicted for over 12 years with this constant haemorrhage, which, as it says in one of the accounts, that she had spent all her savings to try and cure her problem, but she'd only got worse. Something must have been hidden from Yahweh for a prolonged period without any repentance. Her infliction was very similar to that of Zaharat. She would have been forced, because of her circumstances, to remain unmarried and would have been unable to associate with the people of the community. All those restrictions were in accordance with the mitzvot or commands of Vayikra, that's Leviticus chapter 15, where it clearly instructs regarding how a woman has to separate during her period of nidar or menstruation. However, in Vayikra 15:25-27, the mitzvot clearly specified that the woman with a discharge lasting longer than the 7 days was considered differently. And this woman would have fallen into that category. And there were fairly restrictive requirements, similar to those of the person with Zaharat, that they had to isolate themselves. So it's taking great courage for this woman in the midst of a crowd to come up and touch Yeshua. But she had the faith. She had the ability to take that chance. So turning back to Mark chapter 5, whatever the circumstances were that had caused her suffering and condition, she was instantly healed because of her courage, honesty, and faith in Yeshua. And he responded in verse 34 by saying, Daughter, your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be healed from your disease. That's yet another example of the forgiving nature of Yeshua towards all those who have faith and trust in what he was actually saying and teaching and doing. It's also an example of what the Olam Haba, or the age to come, will be like when all people are resurrected. Then he will forgive and restore all who will accept him as the king and the Kohanim, or the high priest. So moving on, we find in the words of Mattityahu, Matthew, in the latter part of chapter 9, that Yeshua had encountered 2 blind men. The situation is unique to that gospel of Mattityahu only. The other 2 synoptics, for unspecified reasons, make no mention of this event. The actual time and location are not specified, but the wording suggests that maybe it occurred shortly after Yeshua had raised the little girl back to life. However, Mattityahu says that they shouted out to him, Son of David, take pity on us. Then, when they were back in the house, possibly Shimon's house, Yeshua challenged the blind men by saying, Do you believe that I have the power to do this? They replied, Yes, sir. Then he touched their eyes and said to them, "Let it happen to you according to your trust." Their sight was restored. Here again we see the same situation with the woman. It is your trust that is bringing about the healing. He was willing to do it because they responded positively towards him. Again, Yeshua sent them away with a strong warning. See that you tell no one about it. Yet again, what did they do? The exact opposite. He wanted nobody to draw attention to his healing capacity, because that was not his primary focus, as we'll see in a moment. But as verse 31 says, instead they went away and talked about him throughout the district. Isn't that typical of people? That incident was followed by yet another healing, yet again recorded in Mattityahu chapter 9 verses 32 to 34, suggesting that it took place immediately after the healing of the blind men, where it says, as they were going, a man controlled by a demon, was unable to speak, was brought to Yeshua. Again, there appears to be many witnesses, because soon as Yeshua had expelled the demon, the crowds yet again were amazed and exclaiming, "Nothing like this has ever happened in Israel before." Now the Perishim, or the Pharisees, were also standing nearby observing all that was happening. And again they became deeply troubled, particularly by the fact that the common people were actually praising Yeshua for all that he was doing. Now, if the Perishim could not find a way to discredit him in the eyes of the people, they were frightened that they were going to lose their religious control over the masses. It was becoming a real problem for them. In desperation, the Perishim responded, "It's through the ruler of the demons that he expels demons." That ridiculous statement was similar to what they said later in Mattityahu chapter 12 verse 24, when again they were accusing Yeshua of healing through the power of Baal Zebul, the ruler of the demons. That's how desperate they were that Yeshua was going to overtake them completely and they were going to lose all authority. But don't we see that even today in a situation where we contrast the message of Yeshua against the structures of either rabbinical Judaism or Christianity? The structures can't cope with the changes that Yeshua will bring. They have to carry on finding ways of getting back to their own system. So following all the healing in Mattityahu rounds off chapter 9 by reminding us that the healing was not the only part of Yeshua's ministry, as he says in verse 35. Yeshua went about all over the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and illness. Which comes first? Mattityahu stresses the primary focus of Yeshua's message was to spread the good news of the kingdom. But, as he said, it says also that he had compassion for the people of the region of Galilee. As it says, they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he had to do this healing out of compassion for the people. But his real message was that the kingdom of God was near. He was going to be the king of the kingdom. And he was there trying to bring people back. What did Yochanan's message say? Turn back to God, for the kingdom is near. And Yeshua continued that same message. That was his primary ministry. The healing was an adage that was important and necessary, but it was the message about the kingdom that was the primary purpose. That was a sad indictment on the Perishim and the Torah teachers, vested with the responsibility of the religious welfare of the common people. But they had clearly failed in their calling. They were on notice. As we see in Mattityahu chapter 23, it gives 7 woes about the Perishim. things that they should have been doing, but things that they weren't doing. Conversely, he says at the beginning of that chapter, do what they tell you when they sit in the seat of Moshe, but don't reflect their way of life. And that was their problem. They had sold themselves out to the system. The legalism that they had basically embraced was setting them apart from Yeshua. The chapter concludes, Matthew's chapter concludes, with Yeshua speaking to his 7 chosen Talmidim, saying, the harvest is rich, but the workers are few. Pray that the Lord of the harvest will send out workers to gather his harvest. The 7 did not understand what Yeshua was saying at that stage, because it wasn't until chapter 10 that in Mattityahu that Yeshua reveals who those 12 chosen men will be. We also see it in the other 2 synoptic gospels as well. They will be vested with the responsibility to go out to the wider community and gather in the human harvest on his behalf. But that is for a later session. Now we turn our attention back to Yochanan, John chapter 5 verse 1, which says, after this there was a Judean festival, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. So what was that festival? Not one of the 4 Gospels gives us any clue. So the only way we can determine which festival Yochanan was speaking about in chapter 5 verse 1 is to look back at Torah itself. There we're told in Shim'on, or Exodus 23:14 through 17, that all the men of Israel were commanded to appear in the presence of Yahweh in the place that he would choose, in the spring, in the summer, and finally in the autumn. The 3 purposes were in the beginning, in the spring at the time of the planting, in the summer at the time of the wheat harvest, and finally in the autumn at the time of gathering in all the produce at the end of the growing season. However, the name of each festival, it is necessary to turn to Devarim, or Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 16, where it spells out the names of each of the festivals. It says, 3 times a year all the men are to appear in the presence of Yahweh, your God, in the place that he will choose, which of course is Jerusalem. At the festival of Matzah, that's the spring one, at the festival of Shavuot, which is the summer, and the festival of Sukkot, which is the autumn. They are not to show up before Yahweh empty-handed, but every man is to give what he can in accordance with the blessing that Yahweh, your God, has given you. So we see, coming back to the words of Yochanan, chapter 5, verse 1, we can see that the festival that Yochanan is speaking about there must be Shavuot. That is further confirmed if we step back further in the same gospel to Yochanan chapter 2 verse 13. It says, it was almost time for the festival of Pesach in Yehuda, so Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now that was the beginning of his ministry. After Yeshua's first miracle, when he turned the water into wine at Cana. Then it says he spent a few days in Capernaum before he and the family went up to Jerusalem for Pesach. So we can see from that the words of Yochanan chapter 5 verse 1 bring us to the end of Yeshua's first cycle of teaching and healing in the Galilee. Briefly recapping on the significant features of the gospel narratives, we can see that we have considered 35 separate events in the time between Yeshua being in Jerusalem for Pesach, when it all started with him overturning the tables in the temple court, followed by the exchange with Nakdamon, before he had the encounter with the woman of Shim'on at the well of Yaakov during his return journey to Galilee. Having been later rejected from the town of Nazareth, he reappeared in Capernaum which of course became his base of operation during the ministry in the Galilee. While not stated, Yeshua appears to have become a long-term guest in the house of Shim'on, because many of the events in and around Capernaum were all centered either in or near Shimon's house. Throughout the account of the three synoptic gospels, there are many references to Yeshua teaching in their synagogues, particularly the one in Capernaum. The reason he spent so much of his time teaching on Shabbat is because he was speaking to people who were peasants or part of the third tier workers who worked from dawn till dusk, 6 days of the week. So there was no time for them to get together and listen to him speaking, except on Shabbat. That's when they followed him around, week after week. So stepping back, we see that during the short time he stayed in Beit Anya, he met Philip, Shim'on, and Andrew. However, Philip was the only one that he personally called at that stage. And upon returning to the Galilee, it appears that Shim'on, Andrew, and the others all went back to their fishing and did not follow Yeshua in the early stages. It's only after he's established himself in Capernaum did he venture down to the shores of the lake, and he personally at that stage called Shim'on and Andrew and went a little further along and found his cousins, Yaakov and Yochanan. Then weeks later, of course, we saw that he went back to the shoreline and he found Mattityahu, the tax collector, in his booth. And nearby was also another one, Levi ben Helphi, who was also practicing the profession of tax collecting. As we saw last week, it was Levi ben Helphi, whose name was actually later changed to Yaakov ben Helphi. Why? The Gospels give us no clue, but suffice to say that as a Levi, he should have been working as a Torah teacher. But doubtless he'd given up his God-given role as part of the ancient Leviim to become a tax collector, because it was much more financially profitable. Levi was considered by both the workers of the third tier and the Perishim of the Torah teachers as one who was no longer part of the community of Yehuda. Against that background, the 4 fishermen had to cope with the reality that 2 tax collectors had actually been gathered into that inner circle. Just imagine the fishermen who had to pass over a large portion of their catch to the tax collectors every time they came ashore. And here they are, 4 of them, suddenly have 2 tax collectors in their midst. Would take a bit of getting used to. However, the banquet given for Levi ben Helphi appears to show or confirm that he had made a complete change in his life. He truly had been walking as a tax collector, but he had to turn from that persona in favor of service alongside his new master. So we'll leave Yeshua now and his Talmudim on the road to Jerusalem in preparation for the celebration of Shavuot. I will take a break from this video series now until the middle of January, because next week I want to consider the significance of Hanukkah, and then we will be adjourning our Shabbat services for 3 weeks over the summer holidays. Shabbat Shalom.